Okay, so intention, intent, E. We'll say that one of the defining characteristics, I agree, that there, at least in the human experience, there is a degree of self-awareness involved. And we can look at the way that we talk because the word intention is just in our language, like the way that we talk about, did you do that intentionally? I think sometimes in a court of law, they try to prove intentionality, to prove that something was done deliberately and not accidentally. So that kind of begs the question, well, what is deliberate? Because isn't every single thing I do in my life deliberate? What would be the defining characteristic between deliberate or not deliberate? Or what is the definition of not deliberate, not intentional? What does that look like? Because we would need two things so that we can contrast them. Otherwise, the concept doesn't really jive, like infinity. I mean, you can't have infinity and finite. The two things are just fundamentally cannot exist simultaneously. So it's actually impossible for the human mind to wrap its head around infinity or even finite, really. But the two concepts require one another to exist. One of the defining characteristics is a characteristic of our mind. And we have a word for it in our like T speak or our four directions kind of thing. So we need a degree of self-awareness. And I just put that as a random number one. I'm not saying like that's the most important thing. Although, hmm, but the second other most important thing. So a degree of self-awareness, but we have what we were calling the threshold. So the mind has this ability to alternate 2 degrees between automatic without self-awareness, below the threshold of active recognition, but it also, to degrees, you can shift the aperture of, you said it, focus. We can shift that aperture and we can go to the other end of that spectrum. And so the threshold of active recognition, that is this line. This is the threshold. This is the line of active recognition. One of the best ways to, and here are other really good words. Well, one of the best ways to observe this is with the breath. And so what this line here is their intention. And so the intention of the human being is always active to a certain extent, because you're right, you're always doing something. So there's some degree of intentionality. So intention actually always exists. You don't have a second of your life without E, without intention. Does that point make sense, Shannon? I want to make sure that's clear. So intention is a function. It's innate.
Yep, that makes sense. We're always doing something.
Mhm. Now, we could clarify the difference between a function and an action. So, function, for example, I'm gonna put my arm out in front of me, and this is flexion. This is flexion of my shoulder. Does that make sense? That's a function of my arm. Does that make
Yeah.
sense? I'm
Yep.
gonna I'm gonna pick up this book. Picking up a book is an action as a result of function. So E is a fundamental function of the human being. Focus is an action. Does that make sense? That's very important to clarify, and I'm not sure I've clarified that very often. Whoops.
Yep, that makes sense. Focus is
Function
about
and
action.
action. Mhm.
Hmm.
So intention exists in the human being. It's innate. It's a part of our, if even in your dreams, actually. But as long as you're not in a dreamless sleep, you know, you haven't been knocked out from, blunt force trauma to your head, then intention is going to exist. But that intention may be lacking a quality. And the quality that I'm talking about is this area here where the intention is above the threshold of active recognition. Now, the way that that could look, one of the best ways to play with this is with breath. Because, and you can start to see this phenomena in the human experience. This idea of intention being above or below the threshold of active recognition. Breath is a great way to do that. So some other words that we could use, and these are in no particular order, 1, 2, 3, but we could say, so our breath, when we bring attention to it, it is either going to be voluntary or involuntary. So the really cool thing about the human brain is we have an aspect of it that is involuntary, and that always exists. So you see the line of active recognition? I'm going to put above it voluntary. And below it, I'm going to put involuntary. So for example, involuntary proprioception. Now, involuntary proprioception could be, Shayna, have you ever gone to pick up something that you thought was going to weigh a certain amount and it didn't, and you like over picked it up?
Yes.
Right. So in general, you don't have to think about common objects and how much they weigh and how much muscle and exertion is necessary to pick up the object. You don't think about that.
No, not necessarily,
You can,
unless it's like something I've never picked up,
and if it's something
normal.
you never picked up, aren't you going to, would you say that the intention is approaching more above the threshold of active recognition? Because you're paying attention to the object, you're like really going to focus on it a little
Yeah,
more
yeah.
than if you,
If it's something I've never picked up, yes.
so
Yeah.
it'll probably have more intentionality.
And that's why sometimes the proprioception is off with items that
Mhm.
you are normally pick up and, oh, this is heavier than
Exactly.
what I expected, or it's lighter than what I expected. And
Mhm.
yeah. So that's, yeah. Hmm.
So let's look at exercise. So a fitness professional is going to tell you to do what while you do your squats in regards to your form and your posture while you're doing certain exercises. Are they going to tell you to just be automatic and below this threshold of active recognition, or are they going to tell you to go above it and really make sure that you're doing something in a very particular way?
Yeah, they're going to tell you to focus in and pay attention to where your body is in space and time, and focus on your breath, because your breath is important while you exercise, or it's important anytime, but
Mhm.
they're going to tell you to focus in and make sure that you're aligned and feeling into your body as you're making the movements.
Mhm. Voluntary and involuntary. The breath is a great example because the breath can be made voluntary and the breath can be made involuntary. So there's a wide variety of examples that we could use to show the difference between voluntary and involuntary. That is intentionality. That is what we're talking about. So if something is occurring involuntary, there's the intention behind it is subconscious. So you can't talk about it, you know. So the idea is that we have a degree of self-awareness. We have this thing called the threshold of active recognition. We know that this intention can be voluntary or involuntary. And well, so who cares? Well, the thing is that the involuntary is always going to exist to a certain extent because we always have subconscious. So, you know, kind of the way that I'm drawing this out is just a way ultimately that we can work with it, which is what I'm leading to. So in the little box of above the threshold of active recognition, that was doing something more voluntarily, you know, if you were doing calligraphy, you know, if you are really focusing on the pen, how the pen is touching the paper, your mind is really starting, and Shane has already used the word focus on what you're doing, the task at hand. You are present. You are actively recognizing the situation and choosing to engage it. I think engagement is another good word that we could use. There's a lot of engagement. That's another good word because we use that word commonly. Be like engage in what you're doing, engagement. So we're going to voluntarily engage with self-awareness. That's really, really great. Now, there's a lot of reasons to do this. One very basic reason is the ancient saying, E leads Chi. But another way that we could say that is our intention shapes our life experience. So while the action is obviously important, I would say that the intention is more important. And I talked about this with my supervisor in clinic because he disagreed. He thinks that the action is more important. The example I gave, though, is that if somebody stomps on your foot accidentally, like they were just walking by, they didn't mean to, it was an honest accident. Yeah, the action still sucks. Your toe is still hurt, could be broken, maybe it's going to be an inconvenience. That shit sucks, right? But if somebody does that on purpose, because, for whatever reason, and they intentionally slam down on my toe, the action may still be the same. I can't say that that's not true, so the action remained the same, but the intentionality was different. One person didn't mean to, and one person did it on purpose. And so how I respond to that would be very different. So I would say that intentionality and intent is more important than the action itself. It
That
also
makes sense.
precedes it.
That makes sense.
But that could be argued, it's fine. We could argue which is more important, the intent or the action.
It could be dependent on the situation as well. I mean, there could be other situations where the action is more important because you need to do something, like rather where yours is a scenario where um, somebody is getting injured from something. It might be an action that you need to move forward, that it is important to do to be able to move forward with whatever you're doing in your life.
So do you have another example of that?
I guess if you are, action is important. If your life your life experience, if you don't work, how are you going to live? Because it requires an action to do something to get money, to be able to get money to feed yourself and house yourself and all of that. So action would be important,
It
and
would, but the
more
intent,
than the intention,
well, no,
because
the
you need to
intention
do
still
it.
preceded. The intention preceded because, well, I think what you're saying though is that both are important. That if you have just the
Yeah,
intention, but you don't have the action, you don't necessarily equal the result. And that's true.
exactly.
And that
Yeah.
would be a more advanced conversation that we've had where we talk about, and advanced, I just mean, it requires more, background. You gotta study a little bit more to, what were we just talking about?
We were just discussing
Oh,
the
yeah, yeah,
intention
how
and the action, which is
intention plus
more
action,
important.
right?
But
Well,
I don't
but yeah,
think one would be more important than the other. Intention is important, and so does action to a certain
mhm.
extent. But
Intention is more important because it precedes and it's the one that we can almost always have determination over. So when we talk about what is like within our control and what is beyond my control, I don't prefer those words, but it's just a way of talking about things. One is absolutely 100% in your control, and that's your intention. The action may not be because we just talked about accident, right? So one is more important. I would say that it's a very close tie, because what Shayna is pointing out is the topic of intention, attention to equal power of will. And then the power of will helps to drive that dynamic so you get shit done, right? So intention, attention to equal the power of will, but you can't take one of those away, especially the action. So if all you have is good intentions, you don't necessarily get shit done, right?
exactly, you
Right.
have all this intention to do,
hmm
but you just don't get anything done.
hmm I would prefer that over a lot of action with no intention because who knows what they're going to do. I would rather person
That's
just
true.
just kind of be um,
Yep.
rendered
It's
inert
kind of
with
the yin and
intention.
yang, the balance between them.
Yeah.
Yep.
I would much rather have a person that's rendered inert in intention, good intention, than a person who is below the threshold of active recognition with a bunch of action. Because who knows? Well, I know exactly what would be leading their output. Their output would be led by habit, addiction, attachment, and routine, very likely. All of the things that exist below the threshold of active recognition, maybe even reflex, bias, things like that. Anyway, we don't want to live like that all the time. Of course, all that exists. So, a person has bias. I do, you do, we all do. That's why it's called unconscious bias, because we have it. And anybody that tells you they don't, they don't really understand what it is. That's just it is what it is. Okay, so intention, attention, E. Now let's just get to the point. The real point is, well, how do we work with all this? What are we talking about? And then we get to the magical word attention. So if we can make this leap that intention equal quiet and focused attention. Woo-hoo. Focused. And I say quiet because for the most part, it is very beneficial to uh, relinquish the tendency to talk to ourselves in our own mind, internal self-chatter, right? Intention does not require that. You can do that intentionally, but typically that is occurring in people's minds well below the threshold of active recognition. It's a habit. Happens to me sometimes. I habitually think about stuff sometimes.
Yep, of course. Yep.
Yeah. And if the moment I notice it, I redirect it.
Especially if you're doing something important like driving a vehicle or walking down the street where it's very busy.
Mhm. Or
It's good to
studying,
make sure that you're safe and
right?
you're paying attention to your outside surroundings so that you don't get hurt.
Especially in Chicago.
Exactly.
So intention equals quiet and focused attention. Well, now we can work with that, right? We now have something that is so embedded in our language. May I have your attention? Give me your attention. Where's your attention? We use this word all the fucking time, but we don't really know anything about it. Like in school, we don't really learn how, to direct our attention, which attention when directed will equal the word that Shayna said at the outset. Those are the words we use. When we start to sustain E, intention, it starts to look like focus and concentration. Now, the interesting thing is that focus and concentration has an aperture, right? You can be locked in like you're going to de-arm a bomb and you're just really focused, but also the focus can be defocused, right? And that's gonna be more of your wu wei. You are in a state of non-action, right? You are harmonizing effortlessly with the world around you. That can still be an intentionality, but it won't involve words in your mind at all, and it shouldn't really, not
Yeah, because
necessarily.
when the
Mhm,
words aren't there to distract you, you have
mhm.
more ability to adapt to your circumstances.
Yes, but there's another line that we could draw, and so our attention, intention is below the threshold, but we have a practice that we call the four directions. And that is designed it'll start to look like this. So we'll start with the same intention line. Um, and it goes up and it goes down, but we're practicing Qigong, so it goes down. But it goes up and it goes up and it goes up. And now we're above the threshold, back down, above the threshold, back down. But over time, eventually, a person can start to embody intentionality. And then they have intentionality when they walk. They have intentionality when they look, when they listen, when they taste, when they touch, when they speak. Did I say that one already? When they think to themselves if they want to, in words, that can have intentionality. Actions can have intentionality. And that is the power of self-awareness and a human element that is rarefied, at the very least, in the universe. Hmm. In a manner of speaking, because it's also the universe itself. But that's again another tangent.
Having the threshold of active recognition to recognize that the intention is necessary throughout your whole day, not just sometimes.
Right. And the way that we do it is with focusing on where is our attention, directing attention and making it voluntary by engaging it to bring it above the threshold of active recognition so that we can embody self-awareness using intent. And that's what the Four Directions practice is. The Four
Right.
Directions practice. The Four Directions practice will help a person engage their attention voluntarily above the threshold of active recognition to increase self-awareness and ultimately calm the mind and focus the mind. What will that result? Intention shapes everything in our life. You end up with a very intentional life experience. Lots of other things I could talk about because that's just the beginning, but I think that'd be good.
I
What do you
guess you
think?
could add like an excerpt of how this could apply, other than intention shapes our life experience and everything. How it applies to how somebody can apply it to their life, like
Well, I'm
starting.
applying it to my life. I could give you past examples, but I'm doing it right now. I have a goal. I have a desire, and the desire is to learn acupuncture specifically right now to the degree that let me stop sharing the screen. To the degree that I can create a positive effect in somebody's life. And that doesn't happen accidentally. It just doesn't. Unless I just, I mean, maybe it could over the next 250 years, but I don't live that long. So if I want to learn this medicine beginning at 43 or 44, if I want to start it at this stage in my life, I have to have a huge degree of focus and intentionality throughout the entire day because 6 classes plus my clinic shift, there's just so much to learn and so much, that is important for me to pass my exams because let's be honest, if I don't pass my exams, I don't get to do the thing. And I want to be able to do the thing, so I got to do that. But I also, really want to learn how to create this positive change, really learn it. So everything from needle technique, where is my intention at the tip of the needle in my hand? Am I allowing for the proper body mechanics for the chi and energy to flow in my own body? I have to practice that when I'm walking to work, when I'm at work, and I need to focus on work too, but when I have those gaps, rather than thinking about politics, or rather than thinking about what other people are thinking, or rather than thinking about something that is some tangent that's completely unrelated to the task or the desire that I really have, well, that's all just a distraction. So I redirect back to where I want my mind to be. Like you walk with me, and every now and then I'll just start rattling off the stuff that I'm focusing on. But that focus is voluntary, that focus is intentional, and that focus is a desired thing that I want. But then on the flip side, I have to have balance. So there's also times where I just need nothing in my mind, right? And I know that that's my intention. I care about that feeling of harmony, that feeling of not being at odds with myself and the universe around me. So a lot of my practice is my breath, my body, the world around me, and often a subject I want to study, or I want to create space in between the thoughts so that I can elongate a type of connection without words, because I find that to be very necessary. So all throughout my day, I'm doing this while I'm walking, while I'm on the train. How is my body presenting in this moment? Not because I care about how somebody is viewing me, but because I got a long day. I got 13 hours to go, And if I'm all, like this, by the end of the day, I'm gonna hate the day. My body's gonna hurt. I'm not gonna be getting things done. My energy's gonna be low, all because I was slouching. There'll be other factors, but slouching was a contributing component. So the second I wake up, my intention, my attention, hopefully is going to be pointing towards my desires. Having your desires clear, that takes time too.
And creating quality.
That's the thing that sometimes the words of study can start to interfere with, because the words of study are words. They are repetitive. And that is a type of energy that uses my ATP, uses my gene, my essence, my personal power. And if I do that too much, then I can't sleep as well. I start waking up too early. My stool gets very loose. I start to have night sweats for no reason. I go from hot to cold. And then before you know it, I can get sick, right? So
Okay.
I'm not void of that.
And
So
that's why you're
mhm,
creating the balance between,
exactly.
yeah, but the quality I'm talking about, when you're talking about focusing in and learning the intricate details of acupuncture,
Mhm.
and that takes a lot of focus and
It
that and
does.
attention, and that creates a quality in your practice when you go to practice, because you're putting
Yeah.
all that focus and intention into what you do.
Hmm.
So that's the type of quality I'm referring. You're creating when you have that deliberate focus, and then you're talking about balancing it, because you have to have that balance between the two, because you can't have too much of one thing without the other. You're creating that quality.
That's true. Well, we could talk about this later if you write this down. One way you could view this. Can I move the whiteboard over? I can't. So just in the corner, I'm going to draw over here, and I'm just going to draw two arrows. This is the four directions. Ideally, we want quality to be this little, and by quality, that's going to take some time to discuss. But what we're talking about is when the mind is aligned with the moment without resistance. You're no longer resisting, fighting, or otherwise at odds with the moment. It's a state of being, in a manner of speaking. So it oscillates this little circle, right? And and the circle represents quality. And you can arrive at this. I arrive at this throughout the day. And sometimes I go away from it too, because I'm not Buddha. And we would have to take some time. I can't describe quality very quickly. Uh, well, I can, but it would still be another 10 or 15 minutes to this video.
Yeah, we could
We'll do that another time. But so
yeah, another time, or just start a new video and do it or whatever. Doesn't matter.
one thing that I was kind of representing is when the focus of attention in the four directions starts to get too heavy in one area, such as cognitive thought. In my example, I was using cognitive thought is still voluntary, but it's my studies. So this is starting to get too heavy. So my four directions is now out of balance. But we would talk about that later. I just want to remind you, and we can talk about what does it look like when our four directions, when we're putting a little too much focus in one. That's why there's four directions. This is a very well
Oh, that
thought
is a
out
good one. Yeah, that's a
practice.
good one.
But the idea now, what Shayna is talking about, what you were talking about is I have this thing that I'm calling nostalgia in advance, where I'm studying and I can just become so present and feel so much quality that I know this is going to be a moment I look back on with fondness. You know, that can be in a coffee shop studying. Like, this is my student experience. Like, I'm just fully soaking this up. I'm going to fully soak up my senior internship, my first patients, and, my first 100 patients, my first 200 patients, my first 5,000 hours, of 5,000's a lot. My first 500 hours of, you know, patient contact, that type of thing. That's all I can imbue all of the work with quality. And that takes a special type of focus. And what happens, Shayna, is remember I talk about the cult, and this is just to remind you to talk about it later, but I talk about the cultivation factor. When all four directions, or at least three, are becoming, because we have establish, elongate, maintain. When we start to elongate and maintain three or four directions, we get it's a kind of a spoiler alert because I don't talk about this much, but we get this little thing, this circle that I put over the four directions, and I call that the cultivation factor. We have now created the intentionality and the space and the self-awareness necessary to fill from the center. We're not always at the center, and then that's not the time to fill. So when we hear tragic news, we're not at the center. That's not the time to fill. That is the time to harmonize with the shaky internal and external environment that's occurring. I just got a C plus on a paper and I forgot to study and I feel bad about that. That's not, I'm not operating from center. I'm counterbalancing, harmonizing a little bit more acutely. So, but when we're doing this practice and we have all four directions, we start to create a type of stability that we can start to imbue that with the cultivation factor. And one of the things you can cultivate absolutely is an underlying quality in everything that you do. Does that make sense? And I can explain that in more detail another time.
Yep, that makes sense.
And I'll just put it up here for the cultivation factor.
Because your intention is to focus on whatever you're focusing on, and if you can also add that to create a quality as well,
A feeling,
a
right?
feeling,
Mm-hmm.
because you're
And
focused in and you're really feeling in to your breath, because that's aligning to your four
it's
directions.
one of your four directions, so that's already there. Yeah,
And
we're
then
implying that.
you have your body attention.
Mm-hmm.
So that could help create the feeling because you're completely focused in cognition, intention, or was it cognition, breath, internal and external
Right.
are all activated when you're doing that.
Yes. Not always to equal degrees. They don't have equal
Right.
degrees.
Yeah,
They don't have to
exactly.
be.
Right. And
Okay.
then, like you said, there are times where tragic things occur. So you're going to be balancing that rather than creating quality. You
And
have to,
well, you
that makes
might
sense.
be able
You
to,
could create a quality still, but
like my grandpa in war,
right.
when he wrote that
That's
paper,
true.
Love in
Yeah,
War. He
that's
was in a
true.
very traumatic circumstance, but he was still able to create the space necessary. Now, before I lose because it's still recorded, so I can't lose it. But what we're talking about is creating this outer circle. And if you notice, this outer circle will disappear when you don't have the four directions as active, when you start to lose your directions. First, you start to lose cognition, usually. If you lose cognition, eventually you'll start to lose breath. I don't lose body. I might start to lose external attention. I still think that, I'm not going to do that for very long but I do not come out of my body attention. I'm just practiced so much that I cannot come out of, I'm aware of my body at this very second. Like my legs are where I put them. I'm breathing into my diaphragm in a certain way because I don't want back pain because I'm doing so much thought with my studies. But yeah, you can observe this that I'm not, the reason that you lose the quality or you lose the cultivation factors because your four directions are starting to break down. Why is it breaking down? Well, maybe something traumatic has happened that you've never experienced. Maybe you're frustrated about something, you're angry about something. Maybe you caught a cold and now you're sick, right? Maybe you slept wrong and you woke up and you got a little liver yang rising, throbbing headache and you just don't feel good and that type of thing. All of that can affect the four directions and that cultivation factor. And it would take a lot of practice to be sick and still be able to maintain the cultivation factor.
Right, exactly.
but
Yep.
it could be done. I'm not
It
going to
could
say
be
it
done.
can't. Yeah.
Yep. Yep. It
I don't
could be
know if
done.
I'll be doing it anytime soon. You know, when I'm sick,
Yeah.
sometimes I'm sick and I just feel shitty and I want to complain and be a big baby, you know.
Sometimes that cultivation factor is just surrendering and allowing your body to heal in
Could
a
be.
certain way. So
Yeah. But
take
just remember
your
as I,
energy is low, so you need to reserve it. So that's your intention, is
that might
to
be your intention.
be
Yeah.
easier on yourself a little bit
Yeah.
so that you can heal and get better.
Hmm. Yeah. But a person realistically is going to start to lose the cultivation factor. The more pain there is, the more discomfort there is, and that does get really tricky. But I would also argue that don't try to maintain the cultivation factor when you're in those extremes. It's redirection time. It's just let's just
Right.
maintain some of our
Yeah.
points of attention so that we don't
Focus
go
on
down
your
a rabbit
breath.
hole. Right.
Yeah. Focus on the breath
And if
and
not your
focus
breath,
on
because
your
it's
cognition.
right.
Yeah.
I would start with body awareness, internal,
Body
external
awareness
first.
too, because you have to be aware of your energy levels.
It's also the
Definitely.
root. It'll
Yeah.
root you to the moment. But
Hmm.
yeah, I would start with internal and external first. Probably most people will start with external, which is their, five senses, six senses, proprioception, that type of thing. But breath is also there. A lot of people, I think Donna has mentioned before that, or you've mentioned before too, that sometimes breath is an establishing point for you.
Yeah. I link the breath with the internal awareness, the body awareness a lot.
And I recommend linking the directions because both directions are active when you link them. Mhm. And the cultivation factor is implying that you have linked all four of your directions. That's again another topic. We would have to discuss that, flesh that out a little bit more. Okay, I think that's a good stopping point. I guess what should I say before we go? Bye.
Yeah, that sounds appropriate.
Okay, so we'll be back
Next week on Friday at 5 again,
Central Time.
Central Standard Time.
All right. Bye everyone who's watching.
Bye.